I stood in my driveway at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, still in my bathrobe, staring at the bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. The adhesive had already started peeling paint off the wood where someone had pressed it down with what must have been considerable force. Violation of Section 4.7.2, Unauthorized Plant Material. I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. Fine $250. Compliance required within 72 hours or additional fines will accrue at $50 per day. I looked over at my front flower bed where 3 small lavender plants sat innocently in the morning sun. I'd planted them just 5 days ago, choosing the spot carefully for optimal drainage and sunlight. The previous homeowner had left nothing but bare dirt and a few struggling weeds. "What the hell?" I muttered, scanning the rest of the notice for some explanation of what exactly was unauthorized about lavender plants. "Morning, Sarah." My neighbor Janet called from across the street, already dressed for work and loading her briefcase into her Honda Civic. "Everything okay over there?" I held up the orange paper. Apparently, my lavender plants are in violation of something. Janet's face immediately shifted to what I'd come to recognize as her HOA drama expression. Eyes, wide lips, pressed into a thin line. She glanced around quickly, then hurried across the street. "Oh no," she said, lowering her voice. "Margaret strikes again." Margaret Hutchins, HOA board president and self-appointed garden police. Janet glanced toward the house at the end of our cul-de-sac, a sprawling 2-story with perfectly manicured everything. She's been making life hell for anyone who doesn't follow her vision of suburban perfection. Last month, she fined the Johnsons $300 because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. The wrong shade of black? Apparently it was midnight black instead of classic black. I couldn't tell the difference if my life depended on it. Janet shook her head. "But listen, you need to be careful with her. She's got the rest of the board wrapped around her finger, and she takes this stuff very seriously. Very seriously." I looked down at the notice again. "But these are just lavender plants. They're not even that big." "Doesn't matter. If it's not on the approved plant list, it's unauthorized. And Margaret maintains that list like it's the Constitution." Janet checked her watch. "Look, I've got to get to work, but you should probably call the management company. The number's on the bottom of the notice." After Janet left, I stood there for another few minutes reading the violation notice over and over. Section 4.7.2. I didn't even have a copy of the HOA rules. No one had given me one when I'd moved in 6 weeks ago. My realtor had mentioned that there was an HOA, but she'd brushed it off as pretty standard stuff, nothing to worry about. I went inside and called the number on the notice. "Sunset Meadows Management. This is Kelly speaking. Hi, I'm calling about a violation notice I received this morning. I'm Sarah Chen at 47 Maple Ridge Drive." "Oh yes, unauthorized plant material. What can I help you with?" "Well, I'm confused about what exactly is unauthorized about lavender plants. I mean, they're pretty common landscaping plants." "Let me pull up your file." I heard typing in the background. "Okay, so the violation was reported by a board member for non-compliance with the approved landscaping guidelines. You'll need to remove the plants and replace them with approved species." "Where can I get a copy of these approved species? I wasn't given any HOA documents when I moved in." More typing. That's odd. You should have received a welcome packet with all the governing documents. Let me send those to you today, but in the meantime, you do need to address the violation within the 72-hour window. So I'm supposed to remove plants without even knowing what I'm allowed to replace them with. I understand your frustration, Mrs. Chen. Tell you what, I'll email you the plant list right now, and I'll put a note in your file that you're waiting on the full documents. That might help if you need to appeal the timeline. Appeal the timeline? If you need more time to comply, you can request an extension through the board. You'd need to submit that in writing to the management company, and we'd forward it to the board for consideration. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, waiting for Kelly's email. The whole situation felt surreal. 3 small lavender plants had somehow triggered a bureaucratic nightmare that I'd never imagined could exist in a suburban neighborhood. My phone buzzed with Kelly's email. The approved plant list was 6 pages long, divided into categories like foundation plantings, accent plants, and ground cover. I scrolled through page after page of Latin names with common names in parentheses. Lavender was nowhere to be found. What was on the list was fascinatingly specific and strangely limited. Hostas were approved, but only 3 specific varieties. Roses were okay, but only in red, white, or pink. No yellow, orange, or purple. Herbs were explicitly prohibited except for ornamental sage Salvia officinalis in silver green varieties only. I was still staring at the list when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a navy blazer despite the July heat. "Mrs. Chen," she said when I opened the door, "I'm Margaret Hutchins, president of the Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association. I wanted to stop by and introduce myself." "Oh, hello." I stepped back to let her in, but she remained on the porch. "I assume you received our notice about the landscaping violation." "Yes, I did. I was just reviewing the approved plant list." Margaret's eyes moved past me to the lavender plants. "Lavandula angustifolia," she said, pronouncing each syllable with precision. "Completely inappropriate for our community's aesthetic vision." "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what's inappropriate about them. They're drought-resistant, low-maintenance, and they smell nice." Mrs. Chen, when we established the landscaping guidelines for Sunset Meadows, we spent considerable time creating a cohesive visual experience for all residents. These guidelines ensure property values remain stable and the community maintains its distinctive character. She pulled out a tablet and started typing. Lavender, while pleasant, creates an unpredictable color palette and attracts excessive bee activity that many residents find objectionable. Bees are good for the environment. "Mrs. Chen, I'm not here to debate environmental policy. I'm here to ensure compliance with community standards that every homeowner agreed to when they purchased their property." She looked up from her tablet. "You did receive your copy of the CCNRs and landscaping guidelines with your closing documents, correct?" "No, actually, I didn't. I just got them today from the management company." Margaret's expression sharpened. "That's highly irregular. Every property transfer requires delivery of governing documents." She typed something else into a tablet. "Regardless, ignorance of the rules doesn't excuse non-compliance. The plants need to be removed by Friday morning." Friday morning. The notice said 72 hours. Today is Tuesday. Friday morning is 72 hours. I looked at my watch. It was already past 11. "But that's not 72 hours from when I received the notice. I found it this morning." "The notice was posted at 6 a.m., Margaret said, consulting her tablet again. "All violations are posted at 6 a.m. to ensure residents have full business days to address compliance issues." "So you were on my property at 6 in the morning?" "The front door is considered common area access for official HOA business, Mrs. Chen, as outlined in Section 12.4 of the CCNRs." I felt my jaw clench. "You were on my property at 6 in the morning to tape a notice to my door about 3 plants that you object to because they might attract bees. I was performing my duties as an elected board member to ensure community standards are maintained." Margaret said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "Standards that protect everyone's property values, including yours. And if I don't remove the plants, additional fines will accrue at $50 per day until compliance is achieved. If non-compliance extends beyond 30 days, the association may remove the offending materials at the homeowner's expense and place a lien on the property for all associated costs." A lien over lavender plants. "Mrs. Chen, I suggest you review the documents you received today very carefully. This community has standards, and those standards are legally binding. Good day." After Margaret left, I sat on my front steps looking at the 3 lavender plants. They were maybe 8 inches tall, their purple flowers just beginning to show colour. I'd spent an hour at the nursery picking them out another hour, carefully preparing the soil, and had been looking forward to watching them grow. Rough morning. I looked up to see a man in his 40s walking toward me from the house next door, carrying a travel mug of coffee. "You could say that," I said, holding up the orange notice. "Dave Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "And let me guess, unauthorized plant material. You've seen this before. Oh, Sarah, you have no idea what you've walked into." Dave sat down on the steps beside me. "Margaret Hutchins has been the HOA president for 8 years, and in that time, she's turned this place into her personal kingdom. Last year, she fined me $150 because my garbage can was visible from the street after pickup. Visible how? The garbage truck didn't put it back in exactly the right spot. It was sitting 18 inches from my driveway instead of being completely hidden behind my house. I had to take time off work to fight it. Did you win? Eventually, but it took 3 months and cost me more in lost wages than the fine would have been. Dave took a sip of his coffee. The thing is, Margaret doesn't just enforce the rules, she interprets them however she wants, and she's got the rest of the board too intimidated to question her. Who else is on the board? Jim Kowalski. He's the treasurer, but he's basically Margaret's yes man. Patricia Wells is the secretary and she's nice enough, but she's scared of confrontation. And then there's Tom Bradley, who's supposedly the vice president, but he almost never shows up to meetings. So it's basically Margaret running everything. Pretty much. And she takes it very, very seriously. She drives around the neighborhood every morning looking for violations. She's got a whole system. Takes photos, measures, distances, checks, paint colors against approved samples. Dave gestured toward Margaret's house. She's got a whole office set up in her spare bedroom with filing cabinets full of violation reports and compliance photos. That sounds, I paused trying to find the right word, completely insane. Yeah, it is. But here's the thing. She's not technically wrong about the rules. The HOA documents really do give her the authority to do most of this stuff. The problem is that nobody expected anyone to actually use that authority to micromanage every blade of grass. So what do I do about the lavender? Well, you've got a few options. You can remove them and plant something from the approved list. You can pay the fines and hope she eventually gets tired of harassing you. Or... Dave paused and looked around to make sure no one was listening. You can fight back. Fight back how? There are rules that apply to Margaret too. HOA boards have to follow proper procedures, give adequate notice hold meetings according to the bylaws. And homeowners have rights that she can't just ignore. Dave finished his coffee. I've been doing some research since my garbage can incident. There are things she's been doing that are definitely not kosher. Like what? Like posting violation notices without proper board approval. The CCNRs require that all fines be approved by a majority of the board at an official meeting. But Margaret's been issuing violations on her own authority and then getting the board to ratify them after the fact, if she bothers to get them ratified at all. I looked down at my violation notice. So this fine might not even be legitimate? Probably not, but proving that is the hard part. Dave stood up and brushed off his pants. Look, I've got to get to work, but if you want to talk more about this, let me know. I've been keeping track of all her questionable decisions, and I think there are enough people in the neighborhood who are fed up with her that we might be able to do something about it. Do something like what? Like call a special meeting to review her actions. Or better yet, call for a recall vote. Dave grinned. It's all there in the bylaws, Sarah. Margaret loves rules so much, maybe it's time someone used the rules against her. After Dave left, I spent the rest of the morning reading through the HOA documents Kelly had sent. The CCNRs were 37 pages of dense legal language that seemed designed to give the HOA authority over everything from house colours to pet breeds to the height of grass. But buried in all that text were also protections for homeowners, requirements for proper notice, rights to hearings, procedures for appeals. And Dave was right about the violation process. According to Section 8.3 of the CCNRs, all fines had to be approved by a majority vote of the board in an official meeting with proper notice to homeowners. The meeting minutes had to be recorded and made available to all residents within 30 days. I called Kelly back at the management company. Hi, Kelly. This is Sarah Chen again. I have a question about the violation process. Can you tell me when the board meeting was where my fine was approved? Let me check. Actually, I don't see a record of that violation being discussed at a board meeting. But that's pretty normal. The board president has authority to issue violations for clear-cut rule violations. But according to the CCNRs, all fines have to be approved by a majority board vote. Oh, I heard typing. Let me... You know what, Mrs. Chen, you might be right about that. Let me look into this and get back to you. Also, can you send me the meeting minutes for the last 6 months? I'd like to review the board's recent decisions. Absolutely. I'll get those to you this afternoon. When the meeting minutes arrived in my email that evening, I spread them out on my dining room table like evidence in a detective case. 6 months of monthly board meetings, each summarized in a few brief paragraphs. What I found was fascinating. Almost every meeting followed the same pattern. Margaret would present a list of violations she'd identified, the board would vote to ratify them, and then they'd discuss routine maintenance issues. But there were no details about individual properties, no discussion of whether the violations were appropriate, and no mention of homeowners being given a chance to appeal or explain. More interesting was what wasn't in the minutes. According to my count, Margaret had issued at least 12 violations in the past 6 months based on the complaints I'd heard from neighbours. But only 4 of those violations appeared in the official meeting minutes. I was still studying the documents when my doorbell rang again. This time, it was a woman in her 30s with 2 small children hiding behind her legs. "Hi, I'm Lisa Park from down the street. I heard you got a violation notice from Margaret. Word travels fast around here." "Oh, you have no idea. Margaret's got her little network of informants who keep her updated on everything that happens in the neighbourhood." Lisa looked over at my lavender plants. "Honestly, I think they're beautiful. I wanted to plant some herbs in my backyard, but after seeing what she did to the Kellys..." "What happened to the Kellys?" "They planted a vegetable garden in their backyard. Just tomatoes and peppers completely hidden from the street. But somehow, Margaret found out and fined them for inappropriate agricultural activity. They ended up having to rip everything out." "How did she find out about it if it was in their backyard?" Lisa glanced around nervously. "Well, there are rumours that she's been using her drone to fly over people's backyards. She claims it's for community security purposes, but..." "She has a drone?" "A big one. I've seen her out in her driveway with it on weekend mornings. My kids think it's cool, but it makes me nervous. I mean, who knows what she's recording?" I thought about Margaret's comment that morning about bees being objectionable to residents. "Lisa, have you or anyone else actually complained about bees or about lavender plants in general?" "Are you kidding? Half the neighbourhood has lavender in their backyards. Mrs. Rodriguez has a huge lavender hedge that's gorgeous. And the Thompsons have bee boxes. They've been trying to help with pollinator conservation." Lisa paused. "But their backyards aren't visible from the street." "So this is really about what's visible from the street?" "With Margaret, everything is about appearances. She wants the neighbourhood to look like a magazine photo. Perfect, uniform, sterile." Lisa's youngest child tugged at her shirt. "Listen, I should get these guys home for dinner. But I wanted you to know that a bunch of us are really fed up with her. If you decide to fight this, you've got support." That evening, I sat in my backyard with a glass of wine, looking at my sad little flower bed. The 3 lavender plants looked even smaller now, dwarfed by the enormity of the bureaucratic machine that had targeted them. But the more I thought about it, the less this felt like it was really about the plants. This was about power, about one person deciding that her vision of perfection was more important than anyone else's right to make basic decisions about their own property. About rules being weaponized to control and intimidate rather than to create genuine community standards. I pulled out my phone and called Dave. "Hey Sarah, how's the lavender drama?" "Dave, you mentioned earlier that you thought Margaret was breaking HOA rules herself. Can you be more specific?" "Oh, absolutely. You want to come over? I've got a whole file." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Dave's living room, looking at a binder filled with printed emails, photos, and handwritten notes. "Okay, so here's what I've documented," Dave said, flipping through the pages. "First, the violation approval issue you've already discovered. Second, she's been holding board meetings without proper notice to residents. Third, she's been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Personal expenses. Her drone for one thing. She claimed it was for community security, but there's no documentation that the board ever approved that purchase. I filed a request to see the financial records, and there's a $1,500 charge to a drone retailer that was categorized as maintenance equipment. Can she do that? Absolutely not. Any expense over $500 requires board approval and has to be documented in the meeting minutes. But there's no record of any discussion about buying a drone." Dave turned to another section of his binder. "Then there's the issue of her trespassing on people's property. She's been going into backyards without permission, claiming she has a right to inspect for violations. But the CCNRs only give her access to common areas and visible exterior areas. Backyards are specifically excluded unless there's a safety concern. So when she found out about the Kelly's vegetable garden, she was trespassing, probably with her drone too, which means she was also potentially violating privacy laws. Dave pulled out a photo. And this is my personal favorite. She painted her own house last year without getting architectural approval from the board. I looked at the photo. Margaret's house appeared to be the same color it had always been. It looks the same to me. Exactly. She went from one shade of beige to a slightly different shade of beige. But according to the CCNRs, any exterior paint change requires prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee, which is basically her since the other members rarely participate. She should have submitted an application and waited for approval just like everyone else. Did anyone call her out on it? Tom Bradley mentioned it at one meeting, but Margaret shut him down and said it was substantially similar to the previous color, so it didn't require approval. But when the Hernandez family wanted to change their shutters from forest green to hunter green, she made them go through the whole approval process and ultimately denied it because the color was not consistent with community standards. I sat back in Dave's chair feeling overwhelmed. This is so much bigger than my lavender plants. Sarah, your lavender plants are just the latest example of Margaret abusing her authority. But here's the thing. She's been getting away with it because most people just comply rather than fight. It's easier to remove 3 plants than to go to war with the HOA president. But what if we did go to war? Dave grinned. Well, funny you should ask. I've been in touch with a few other homeowners who've had run-ins with Margaret. We've been talking about calling a special meeting to address some of these issues. What kind of special meeting? The bylaws allow any group of homeowners representing at least 20% of the properties to call a special meeting to discuss board actions. We've got 18 houses signed on so far. We need 24 to reach the threshold. And what would happen at this meeting? We could vote on a resolution censuring Margaret for her violations of HOA procedures. We could demand a full financial audit. We could call for her resignation. Dave paused. Or we could call for a recall vote to remove her from the board entirely. Can we actually do that? According to the bylaws, yes. It requires a majority vote of all homeowners, but if we can document enough wrongdoing, it's definitely possible. I thought about Margaret's expression that morning when she'd told me about the lien process. The casual way she'd threatened to put a legal claim on my house over 3 small plants. Dave, count me in, but I want to do this right. If we're going to challenge Margaret, we need to be absolutely sure we're following every rule perfectly. Agreed? And I know just the person to help us. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a lawnmower outside my window. I looked out to see Margaret herself dressed in khaki pants and a sun hat mowing the grass median in the center of our cul-de-sac. It was barely 7 a.m. I watched her for a few minutes, noting how she kept glancing toward my house. When she reached the section of median closest to my property, she slowed down considerably, taking extra time to edge around the small oak tree there. That's when I realized she was taking photos. I grabbed my phone and started recording from my bedroom window. Margaret had pulled out her cell phone and was taking pictures of my front yard from multiple angles. She spent particular attention on the lavender plants crouching down to get close-up shots. When she finished with the photos, she walked directly onto my property to examine the plants more closely. I watched her pull out a measuring tape to check the distance between the plants and my front walkway. I threw on clothes and went outside. "Good morning, Margaret," I called out as I approached her. She looked up from her measuring tape, not appearing the least bit embarrassed to be caught on my property. "Mrs. Chen, I'm documenting the current status of your violation for the board meeting tomorrow night." I wasn't aware there was a board meeting tomorrow night. Emergency meeting to address ongoing compliance issues. She stood up and made a note on a small pad. Your violation period expires tomorrow at 6 a.m. and these plants are clearly still in place. Actually, Margaret, I've been reviewing the HOA documents and I have some questions about the violation process. Mrs. Chen, the time for questions was before you planted unauthorized materials. The compliance deadline is firm. According to Section 8.3 of the CCNRs, violations have to be approved by a majority board vote before fines can be assessed. Can you tell me when the board voted on my lavender plants? Margaret's expression tightened. The board ratifies all violations at our monthly meetings. But the next monthly meeting isn't until next week, and I couldn't find any record of an emergency meeting where this was discussed. Mrs. Chen, as board president, I have the authority to issue violations for clear violations of established community standards. Actually, according to the bylaws, the board president can issue warnings, but monetary fines require a board vote. I pulled out my phone with the recording I'd just made. Also, the CC&Rs specify that board members need permission from homeowners before entering private property for inspections. Margaret looked at my phone, then back at me. Mrs. Chen, I suggest you focus on compliance rather than trying to find technicalities to avoid your responsibilities to this community. I'm not looking for technicalities, Margaret. I'm looking for proper procedure. If the HOA is going to fine homeowners and threaten liens, it needs to follow its own rules. The emergency board meeting tomorrow night will address your violation and any additional fines that have accrued. I suggest you attend if you have concerns. I'll definitely be there. What time and where? Margaret paused. 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse. And you've sent proper notice to all homeowners. Emergency meetings require 24 hours notice which residents will receive this afternoon. After Margaret left, I called Dave immediately. Dave, there's an emergency board meeting tomorrow night about my violation. But I think Margaret's making this up as she goes along. What do you mean? She says they're going to ratify my violation and assess additional fines, but I don't think she's actually consulted with the rest of the board. And she was just on my property taking photos and measurements without permission. That's it, Dave said. Sarah, we need to accelerate our timeline. Can you meet with Patricia Wells today? The board secretary. Yeah, she's actually pretty reasonable when Margaret's not around. And more importantly, she keeps the official meeting records. If Margaret's planning an unauthorized emergency meeting, Patricia will know about it. Patricia Wells lived in a modest ranch house on the other side of the neighborhood. When I knocked on her door that afternoon, she answered wearing gardening gloves and looking flustered. Mrs. Chen, I was just going to call you. Margaret told me there's an emergency board meeting tonight about your landscaping violation, but I don't understand what the emergency is. Tonight she told me it was tomorrow night. Patricia's face fell. Oh no, she told me tonight at 7, and she said you'd already been notified. She pulled off her gardening gloves. Come in, please. I think we need to talk. Patricia's living room was comfortable and cluttered the opposite of Margaret's sterile perfection. She poured us each a glass of iced tea and sat down across from me with a sigh. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. I've been on this board for 3 years, and I've watched Margaret become more and more controlling. When I first joined, we actually worked together to solve problems and help the community. Now it feels like we just rubber stamp whatever Margaret decides. Can you tell me about the process for approving violations? Well, officially, we're supposed to discuss each violation at our monthly meetings. Margaret presents the details. We determine if it's actually a violation of the CC&Rs, and then we vote on what action to take. Patricia took a sip of her tea. But lately, Margaret's been issuing the violations first and then asking us to ratify them after the fact. She says it's more efficient. Is that legal? I don't think so. Tom Bradley raised concerns about it a few months ago, but Margaret got very angry and accused him of trying to undermine community standards. Tom stopped coming to most meetings after that. What about Jim Kowalski? Jim just goes along with whatever Margaret says. I think he's afraid of her, honestly. Patricia paused. Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? Are you planning to fight this violation? I'm considering it. Patricia, this emergency meeting tonight, was it properly called according to the bylaws? No. Emergency meetings require notification to all board members at least 24 hours in advance, and homeowners have to receive notice too. Margaret called me this morning and said we needed to meet tonight. I haven't even had time to notify the other board members, and I definitely haven't sent notices to homeowners. So the meeting isn't legitimate, not according to our own rules, no. But Margaret will probably hold it anyway and claim it was necessary to address an urgent compliance issue. I leaned forward. Patricia, what would happen if homeowners called for a special meeting to review board procedures? You mean like a review of Margaret's actions? Patricia looked around nervously as if Margaret might be listening. Technically, homeowners have that right. But it would require 20% of the neighborhood to sign on, and Margaret would fight it every step of the way. What if homeowners already had the signatures? Patricia's eyes widened. Do you? We're close. Patricia, I know you're in a difficult position, but if homeowners called a legitimate special meeting following all the proper procedures, would you support it? Mrs. Chen, I became a board member because I wanted to help my neighbours and maintain our community. But what Margaret's been doing lately isn't about community, it's about control. If there's a way to get back to proper procedures and respectful governance, yes, I would support that. I left Patricia's house with a lot more information than I'd expected, and a growing sense that Margaret's authority wasn't as absolute as she pretended. But first, I needed to deal with the immediate problem of tonight's illegitimate emergency meeting. I called Dave and filled him in on everything Patricia had told me. Okay, Dave said, here's what we're going to do. You're going to show up at that meeting with a recording device and a copy of the bylaws. When Margaret tries to assess additional fines, you're going to challenge the legitimacy of the meeting itself. Is that smart? Won't that just make her angrier? Sarah, she's already threatened to put a lien on your house over 3 plants. How much angrier can she get? Dave paused. Besides, we need her to make mistakes. If she tries to hold an illegitimate meeting and assess unauthorized fines, that's evidence we can use. Evidence for what? For the special meeting. I talked to Tom Bradley this afternoon, and he's willing to testify about Margaret's pattern of violating HOA procedures. Combined with what Patricia told you and the documentation I've been keeping, we'll have a solid case for a recall vote. That evening, I drove to the community clubhouse with a knot in my stomach. The building was small and dated with fluorescent lighting and folding tables that had probably been there since the 1980s. I arrived at exactly 7 p.m. to find Margaret sitting alone at a table in the front of the room. Mrs. Chen, she said without looking up from her papers, I'm glad you decided to attend. Where are the other board members? Jim will be here shortly. Patricia had a family emergency and Tom is out of town. So this meeting doesn't have a quorum. Margaret looked up sharply. Mrs. Chen, this is an emergency meeting to address a specific compliance issue. A full board quorum is not required for administrative matters. According to the bylaws, emergency meetings still require proper notice and a quorum for any official votes. Mrs. Chen, I'm trying to help you resolve this violation without additional penalties. If you'd prefer to proceed through the formal hearing process, we can certainly do that. At that moment, Jim Kowalski hurried in looking harried and confused. He was a thin man in his 60s who reminded me of a nervous accountant. Sorry I'm late, Margaret. Traffic was terrible. He glanced around the empty room. Where is everyone? It's just us tonight, Jim. Emergency meeting to address Mrs. Chen's landscaping violation and determine additional penalties for non-compliance. Jim looked confused. I thought emergency meetings required 24 hours notice to homeowners. Jim, we discussed this. The violation period expired this morning and we need to determine next steps. But Margaret, I don't have any of the documentation about this violation. I don't even know what plants we're talking about. I pulled out my phone and set it on the table. I'm recording this meeting for my records, which is my right under the HOA bylaws. Margaret's face flushed. Mrs. Chen, this is a board meeting, not a public forum. According to Section 15.7 of the bylaws, homeowners have the right to attend board meetings and record them for personal use. Since this meeting concerns a violation against my property, I have a right to be here. Jim was looking back and forth between Margaret and me like a tennis spectator. Margaret, maybe we should postpone this until the next regular meeting when everyone can be here. Jim, the compliance deadline has passed. Additional fines are accruing. But what fines? Jim asked. I don't remember voting on any fines. The violation was issued according to standard procedures. We're here to ratify the decision and determine additional penalties. I opened my copy of the CC&Rs to Section 8.3. Actually, according to this section, all fines must be approved by a majority board vote before they can be assessed. Since there was no board vote, the original fine is invalid. Margaret stood up abruptly. Mrs. Chen, if you're going to continue to disrupt this meeting with frivolous procedural objections, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I'm not disrupting anything. I'm pointing out that this entire meeting violates your own bylaws. You didn't give proper notice, you don't have a quorum, and you're trying to assess fines that were never properly approved. Jim was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Margaret, she might have a point. Maybe we should consult with the management company about proper procedures. Jim, I've been running this board for 8 years. I know what the proper procedures are. But if Mrs. Chen is right about the voting requirement, Jim, are you questioning my authority as board president? No, Margaret, I'm just saying maybe we should double-check the rules before we make any big decisions. Margaret gathered up her papers with sharp, angry movements. Fine. Jim, since you're apparently more concerned with technicalities than with community standards, I'll postpone this meeting until you have time to review the relevant sections of the CC&Rs. Margaret, that's not what I meant. But Margaret was already walking toward the door. She paused when she reached me. Mrs. Chen, your violation stands. Additional fines will continue to accrue until you achieve compliance. And I want you to know that your disruptive behavior tonight will be noted in my report to the management company. After Margaret left, Jim and I sat in the fluorescent lit room for a few minutes in awkward silence. Mrs. Chen, I want to apologize, Jim finally said. This isn't how board meetings are supposed to work. Jim, can I ask you something? Did the board actually vote to approve my violation? Jim rubbed his forehead. Honestly, I don't remember discussing your specific violation at any meeting. Margaret usually just presents us with a list of violations she's issued, and we vote to ratify them all at once. So you've been approving violations without reviewing the details. I know that sounds bad, but Margaret handles all the day-to-day compliance issues. She's very thorough, and she knows the rules better than anyone. Jim paused. But after tonight, I'm wondering if maybe we should be more involved in the process. Jim, I'm not trying to undermine the HOA, but I think homeowners deserve fair treatment and proper procedures. You're absolutely right. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to attend our next regular board meeting? I think the full board needs to discuss how we handle violations. I drove home that night feeling like I'd won a small battle, but still faced a much larger war. Margaret's reaction to being challenged had revealed just how much she relied on intimidation and the assumption that no one would bother to read the actual rules. But she wasn't going to back down easily. The next morning, I found another orange notice taped to my front door. Second notice of violation. Section 4.7.2. Unauthorized plant material. Additional fine $50. Total amount due $300. Compliance required immediately, or additional fines will continue to accrue. I called Kelly at the management company again. Kelly, I received another violation notice this morning, but the meeting where this was supposed to be approved was cancelled last night. Let me check our records. I don't show any board meeting minutes from last night, Mrs. Chen. That's because the meeting was cancelled due to procedural issues. But Margaret Hutchins issued another fine anyway. That's not how this is supposed to work. Let me contact Mrs. Hutchins and get clarification. Kelly, I think we need to have a broader conversation about HOA procedures. I'd like to file a formal complaint about the violation process. Absolutely. I'll send you the complaint forms today. An hour later, Dave knocked on my door with a grin and a manila folder. Sarah, you're not going to believe this. Tom Bradley called me this morning. He heard about what happened at the meeting last night, and he wants to meet with us. What did he hear? Apparently, Jim Kowalski called him after you left. Jim's been having doubts about how Margaret runs things, and your challenge last night was the last straw. So Tom's willing to help? More than willing. He's been keeping his own records of Margaret's questionable decisions, and he's ready to support a recall vote. That afternoon, I found myself in Tom Bradley's backyard, sitting around a patio table with him and Dave. Tom was a quiet man in his early 70s, a retired engineer who spoke carefully and precisely. Before we go any further, Tom said, I want you both to understand what we're talking about. A recall vote is serious business. If we do this, we need to be absolutely certain we can prove Margaret has violated her duties as a board member. What kind of proof do we need? I asked. Tom opened a thick binder similar to Dave's. I've been documenting Margaret's actions for the past year. What I've found is a pattern of behavior that violates both the letter and the spirit of the HOA bylaws. He flipped to a section marked Financial Irregularities. Starting with the obvious, Margaret has made several purchases using HOA funds without board approval. The drone Dave mentioned, but also a new computer for her home office landscaping tools, and even a storage shed for what she calls community equipment. How much money are we talking about? Just over $4,000 in unauthorized expenditures over the past year. Tom turned to another section. Then there's the issue of meeting procedures. Margaret has been calling emergency meetings without proper notice, making decisions without quorum, and failing to keep accurate minutes. Can you prove that? I've been comparing the official minutes with my own notes from meetings I've attended. There are significant discrepancies. Decisions that were never voted on appear in the minutes as approved. Dissenting votes are recorded as unanimous approval. Dave leaned forward. Tom, what about the trespassing issue? Ah, yes, that's perhaps the most serious problem. Tom pulled out a series of photographs. Margaret has been using her drone to conduct surveillance of private property without homeowner consent. She's also been entering backyards and fenced areas without permission. Is that illegal? Potentially. HOA boards have limited rights of inspection, and those rights are carefully defined in the CC&Rs. Margaret has been exceeding those rights, and in some cases her actions could constitute criminal trespassing. I looked at the photos which showed aerial views of various backyards in our neighbourhood. Tom, how did you get these? Margaret sent them to me in an email last month asking me to review what she called compliance issues. She didn't seem to realise that documenting her own surveillance activities wasn't exactly smart. Tom closed the binder and looked at both of us seriously. Here's what I propose. We call a special homeowners meeting to review Margaret's conduct and vote on her removal from the board. But we do this absolutely by the book. Proper notice, clear documentation, and a professional presentation of the facts. How many homeowners do we need? 20% to call the meeting, which is 24 households. 50% plus 1 to actually remove her, which is 61 votes. Dave pulled out his own folder. We've got 18 signatures so far. Getting 6 more shouldn't be hard, especially after word spreads about what happened last night. And the removal vote, that's going to be harder, Tom admitted. A lot of people are unhappy with Margaret, but voting to remove an elected board member is a big step. We'll need to present a compelling case that she's actually harmed the community. What about Patricia and Jim? Will they support this? Patricia will quietly. Jim's wavering, but I think he'll come around. The key is showing people that this isn't about personal animosity. It's about restoring proper governance to the HOA. Over the next week, I threw myself into what Dave started calling Operation Lavender. We spent evenings going door to door explaining the situation to neighbours and gathering signatures for the special meeting petition. The response was eye-opening. Nearly every household had a story about Margaret's overreach. The Patel family had been fined for parking their car on the street during a family gathering. The Hendersons had been told their window boxes were the wrong shade of green. The elderly Mr. Jackson had been threatened with fines because his garbage can blew over in a windstorm and wasn't immediately uprighted. But the story that really got to me came from Maria Santos, a single mother who lived in one of the smaller houses near the back of the neighbourhood. Last winter, my son built a snowman in our front yard, Maria told me. Just a regular snowman with a carrot nose and stick arms. The next day, Margaret left a note on my door saying temporary decorative structures required architectural approval and I needed to remove it immediately. She wanted you to get approval for a snowman that would melt in a day or two anyway, but she said it set a precedent for unauthorized yard displays. Maria shook her head. My son was 8 years old. He was so proud of that snowman. When I told him we had to knock it down because the HOA said so, he cried. Did you fight it? Mrs. Chen, I work 2 jobs and I'm raising 3 kids by myself. I don't have time to fight the HOA over a snowman. It was easier to just knock it down and tell my son that sometimes adults have stupid rules. But Maria signed our petition immediately. If there's a chance to get rid of Margaret Hutchins, count me in. By Friday afternoon, we had 26 signatures, 2 more than we needed. Tom helped me draft the formal petition for a special meeting, carefully following every requirement in the bylaws. We scheduled it for the following Thursday evening, giving everyone the required 10 days' notice. That's when Margaret launched her counterattack. I came home from work on Monday to find a thick envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal notice of a compliance hearing scheduled for Wednesday night, along with a bill for $450 in accumulated fines and legal fees. Legal fees, I said aloud, scanning the documents. According to the notice, my continued non-compliance had forced the HOA to consult legal counsel regarding lien procedures and collection actions. I was being charged $200 for the attorney consultation, in addition to the original $250 fine and $50 daily penalties. I called Dave immediately. Dave, she's escalating. Legal fees, lien threats, the whole works. Sarah, this is exactly what we expected. Margaret knows about the special meeting. The notice went out to all homeowners today. She's trying to intimidate you into backing down. Well, it's working. $500 is a lot of money. Don't pay it, not yet. Let's see what happens at your compliance hearing. Are you sure? What if she actually does put a lien on my house? Sarah, everything Margaret's done has been procedurally questionable. If she tries to place a lien based on illegitimate fines, we'll have even more ammunition for the recall vote. The compliance hearing was held in the same community clubhouse where the previous week's drama had unfolded. This time, all 4 board members were present, along with a stern-looking woman in a business suit who introduced herself as the HOA's attorney. Mrs. Chen, Margaret began, "You've been in violation of community landscaping standards for over a week. The purpose of tonight's hearing is to determine final resolution of this matter. I'm here to dispute the validity of the original violation," I said, setting my own documents on the table. The attorney leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I represent the Sunset Meadows HOA. Can you explain the basis for your dispute? The fine was issued without proper board approval as required by Section 8.3 of the CC&Rs. Additionally, the violation notice process didn't follow the procedures outlined in the governing documents." Jennifer Walsh looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Hutchins, can you provide documentation showing board approval for this violation?" Margaret shuffled through her papers. "The board ratifies all violations at our monthly meetings. This violation will be ratified at next week's meeting." "But the fine was assessed over a week ago," I pointed out. "The CC&Rs require board approval before fines can be charged, not after." Jennifer Walsh frowned. "Mrs. Hutchins, do you have records showing when the board approved this specific violation?" The room fell silent. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Jim studied his hands. Tom sat back with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with obvious interest. "Ms. Walsh?" Margaret said, her voice tight. "As board president, I have the authority to issue violations for clear violations of established standards. The board's role is to review and ratify my decisions." "Actually," Tom Bradley spoke up, "that's not accurate. The bylaws give the board president authority to issue warnings and notices, but monetary fines require a majority board vote." Margaret turned on Tom with surprising venom. "Tom, if you have concerns about board procedures, you should have raised them during the proper channels, instead of ambushing me at a homeowner hearing." "I did raise concerns, Margaret, multiple times. You dismissed them." Jennifer Walsh held up her hand. "Let me clarify the situation. Mrs. Chen, what exactly are you seeking?" "I want the fine dismissed because it was issued improperly. And I want assurance that future violations will follow proper procedures." "Mrs. Hutchins, based on what I'm hearing, it does appear there may have been procedural issues with this violation. I recommend that the board vote tonight on whether to ratify this fine or dismiss it." Margaret's face was red now. "Ms. Walsh, we're paying you for legal advice, not to second-guess our internal procedures." "Actually, Mrs. Hutchins, you're paying me to ensure that HOA actions are legally sound. Procedural violations can expose the association to liability." Tom leaned forward. "I move that we vote to dismiss Mrs. Chen's violation due to procedural deficiencies." "I second," Patricia said quietly. "All in favour?" Tom asked. Patricia and Tom raised their hands. Jim hesitated, then slowly raised his hand as well. Margaret stared at her fellow board members in shock. "This vote is out of order. I haven't called for a motion." "Actually," Jennifer Walsh said, "any board member can make a motion during a properly called meeting. The motion has passed 3-1. "I haven't voted yet," Margaret snapped. "You're welcome to vote, but the motion has already received a majority." Margaret looked around the table at her fellow board members, her expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Fine. The violation is dismissed. This meeting is adjourned." As everyone filed out, Tom approached me. "Sarah, that was exactly what we needed. Margaret just demonstrated to her own attorney how she operates and how the rest of the board feels about her methods. What happens now?" "Now we focus on Thursday's special meeting. After tonight, I think we'll have more support than we expected." The special homeowners meeting was held in the elementary school cafeteria, the only space large enough to accommodate the crowd that showed up. I counted at least 80 people, nearly three-quarters of the neighborhood. Dave had prepared a detailed presentation documenting Margaret's violations of HOA procedures. Tom provided testimony about the pattern of unauthorized decisions and financial irregularities. Patricia, looking nervous but determined, confirmed that proper procedures had not been followed for many recent board actions. But the most powerful moment came when Maria Santos stood up to speak. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 6 years," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "When I moved here, I thought an HOA would protect our property values and keep the community nice. But what we have instead is one person who treats us like children, who can't be trusted to make basic decisions about our own homes." She looked directly at Margaret, who was sitting in the front row with her arms crossed. "Mrs. Hutchins, last winter you made my 8-year-old son destroy his snowman because you said it was an unauthorized decoration. You've fined families for having birthday parties because their guests parked on the street. You've threatened people with liens over the color of their mailboxes." Maria's voice grew stronger. "This isn't community leadership. This is bullying." The room erupted in applause. Margaret stood up abruptly. "If people don't want to follow community standards, they're welcome to move to neighborhoods without HOAs," she said loudly. "I was elected to maintain property values and enforce the rules that everyone agreed to when they bought their homes. But you weren't elected to make up new rules as you go along," called out Dave. "And you weren't elected to spend HOA money without board approval. Everything I've done has been for the benefit of this community." "Flying drones over people's backyards is for our benefit," shouted someone from the back of the room. The meeting continued for another hour, with homeowner after homeowner standing up to share their experiences with Margaret's enforcement tactics. By the time we called for the vote, the outcome was obvious. 68 homeowners voted to remove Margaret Hutchins from the board. 12 voted against removal. Margaret herself didn't vote, stalking out of the meeting after the vote count was announced. As people filed out of the school cafeteria, I found myself standing next to my 3 lavender plants, which Dave had brought as props for his presentation. They were still in their original pots, still healthy, despite everything that had happened around them. "So what now?" I asked Tom. "Now we hold a new election for board president, and we start the process of revising our governing documents to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again." "And the lavender?" Tom smiled. "I think the first order of business for the new board should be reviewing the approved plant list. Something tells me it might need some updates." 3 months later, I was standing in my front yard admiring my expanded flower bed. The 3 original lavender plants had been joined by rosemary, oregano, thyme, and a small vegetable garden that stretched along the side of my house. The new board had eliminated the approved plant list, entirely replacing it with simple guidelines about maintaining a neat appearance and not blocking sightlines. Margaret had moved out of the neighborhood 2 weeks after the recall vote, selling her house to a young family with twin toddlers who immediately planted a children's play area in their front yard. The new HOA board, led by Tom Bradley as president and Patricia Wells as vice president, had instituted monthly community meetings where residents could raise concerns and suggest improvements. They'd also established clear procedures for violations, including mandatory board review before any fines could be assessed. But perhaps most importantly, they'd created an atmosphere where neighbors felt comfortable talking to each other about problems instead of immediately escalating to formal complaints. "Sarah," my neighbor Janet called from across the street, "the lavender smells amazing. Do you mind if I plant some too?" "Of course not," I called back. "I've got extra seeds if you want some." As I watched Janet cross the street to look at my garden, I reflected on everything that had happened since that first morning when I'd found the orange violation notice on my door. It had started as a simple dispute about 3 small plants, but it had revealed something much more important about how communities function, or dysfunction. The lesson wasn't that HOAs are inherently bad, or that rules and standards don't matter. The lesson was that power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse, and that ordinary people have more ability to create change than they often realize. Sometimes it just takes someone willing to read the fine print and ask uncomfortable questions about whether the people in charge are actually following their own rules. This is a dramatized story inspired by common HOA disputes, not legal advice.